I've made the claim before on this channel that every single OCD patient I've ever treated has improved, and that is true. But there is one thing that can make treatment almost impossible. And it's not how severe the symptoms are, how long the OCD has been present, or whether they're on medications or not. It's actually a much more interesting psychological factor. It's whether they can imagine that the OCD might be wrong. And today I want to explore that main barrier to improvement through two patient stories. The story of Sylvia, the woman who was convinced that her husband was a drug addict, but nobody believed her. And the story of Daniel, a man who couldn't stop trying to protect his family from poisoning. But first, for those of you who are new to the channel, welcome. I'm Dr. Robert. I'm a board-certified psychiatrist, and I specialize in OCD and anxiety disorders. And on this channel, I enjoy making mental health videos. And of course, as always, these are just educational videos, not mental health advice. If you are experiencing any mental health symptoms, please seek the care of a local mental health care provider. And also, any patient stories have been greatly altered to protect patient identity. So let's first jump into the case of Daniel. He was a man that came to me a few years ago, complaining that he was struggling with falling asleep. He was in his 30s, had a fairly successful career, was married, had a daughter, and all things seemed to be going pretty well. But when he told me about his insomnia, it sounded pretty severe. Most nights he really struggled with falling asleep and was pretty exhausted the next day. Naturally, this led to a lot of stress, frustration, so he was seeing a psychiatrist for help with his sleep. Simple enough, or at least that's how it seemed at first. Because then I began asking him, what was his nightly routine? What did bedtime look like for him? That's a common question I ask. And when he started to walk me through it, something definitely stuck out. He told me how he put his kids to bed, checked some emails. He told me that he checked the water. That kind of caught my attention. Check the water, what does that exactly mean? And that's when he told me he tested the water. And I asked him again, well, what do you mean by testing the water? And he seemed a little bit embarrassed and taken aback by this. But he did indulge me. He filled me in that living in the city, he was worried about the quality of the water, especially the tap water. And so he just took the precaution of testing the water at night before bed. I thought that was reasonable enough. Living in the city, there are a lot of contaminants in water. It's old piping that's many, many decades old. You should be concerned about there being contaminants in the water, especially lead. But when I probed further, Daniel filled me in on some concerning details. He had multiple test kits at home designed to test the water for lead contaminants from different brands, just to ensure that if there was a false positive or negative on one, he had another one to check it with. And he also had multiple filtration systems in his home to filter out the water. He even did this with bottled water, concerned that there might be contaminants at the bottling facility. Even when it came to brushing teeth, the water that he, his wife, and his child used had to be tested as well. If they were cooking, you sure as heck that water was getting tested as well. And if something felt off, the water didn't boil right, didn't look right, might be contaminated, out it went, and again they had to restart. As he was describing this, he didn't seem as concerned or find it as out of the ordinary as I did, though he did seem to understand that it was a little bit excessive and he was a little bit embarrassed by it. And I asked him how his wife felt about this. And he admitted that, she was frustrated by it, she kind of had to put up with him doing this, and that was a point of contention in the marriage. When I asked him how long this had been going on, he said that even when he was a child, there was actually a very serious contamination issue in the local water supply that led to some kids developing serious neurologic issues. And his sibling was one of them. So this sort of checking behavior spawned from an actual incident. What began as proper caution transformed into something completely different. The certainty became intolerable. The potential of harm to him, his daughter, was unacceptable in his life. He needed certainty. He needed to be absolutely certain every time that the water was contamination free. And then he told me that the other people in his life just didn't understand. They didn't grasp just how serious of an issue this was. And he actually felt a little bit bad for the people who didn't take this as seriously as he did. And as he was describing all this to me, I did feel a bit of excitement starting to stir up in me. Being an OCD specialist, I was kind of attuned to the hallmark behaviors and thought processes in OCD. So I was able to recognize that there was this intrusive thought, this obsession around, is something contaminated or not? And then this real intense need to chase certainty around it. So all these compulsive behaviors to ensure that he was safe. And the progression of this sort of getting worse and more restricting to his life over time. This was a form of contamination OCD, with very extensive compulsive rituals to try to seek certainty. I remember almost feeling eager that I would be able to give him this diagnosis. I would be able to give him an answer as to why this is happening. And it also helped with his insomnia, because the reason he wasn't able to fall asleep was that he was continually going back to recheck the water or feeling anxious about the water quality. Did he check it enough? Did he take enough precautions? And that was leading to the rumination that was causing his insomnia, his chief complaint. So I was going to be the hero psychiatrist coming in at the end of the session, giving him a diagnosis, giving a name to what was going on, explaining away his obsessions, his compulsions. As at the end of the visit, I explained to him what OCD was, how it manifested, what he was experiencing seemed to fit that profile. He listened fairly politely, but at the end of it, he was pretty skeptical. I have to make sure my family is safe, he said. And of course, I assured him his family's safety was a priority, but so was managing his OCD symptoms, that we could figure out next time we met a plan of moving forward with that. So we scheduled the follow-up, and I was eager to get into treatment planning next time we met. But when his appointment rolled around, he did not show up. I called and emailed him, but to no avail. He never responded to me. And I was kind of left trying to figure out, why didn't he come back? Why did he not want his OCD treated? What was going on? Of course, this was still very early in my career. So next, let's talk about what went wrong here. So the reason Daniel didn't follow up and couldn't get started on improving his symptoms wasn't because his case was severe. I treated much more severe cases than that. The answer lies in this concept called cognitive fusion, and it stems from ACT therapy, or acceptance and commitment therapy. Cognitive fusion is when we become so attached to a thought. The thought becomes reality, not a potential concern, possibility, but a fact. And at this point, Daniel wasn't thinking my water may be contaminated. He was thinking my water definitely is contaminated, and it's very reasonable for me to take all these precautions to make sure that it's not. And what happened was this. Me directly challenging his long-held beliefs was not moving us any closer towards him getting better. Because from his perspective, I wasn't here to help. I was here just to potentially cause more harm to his family by trying new things. Instead, what he wanted to do was what OCD wanted to do, which is double down on reassurance seeking. And cognitive fusion, to some degree, is a problem of insight. So let's take a moment to look at insight as existing on a spectrum. Most people think of OCD as being ego-dystonic, or having the intrusive thoughts that arise from OCD as feeling alien outside of us. Some examples can be like harm OCD. So where people have intrusive thoughts, obsessional thinking around, will I harm myself? Will I lose control and potentially harm someone else? Did I harm someone else? And these are very much thoughts that feel outside yourself. You don't want to hurt yourself, but then these thoughts keep coming up. But in this case, to some degree, Daniel was finding that his thoughts, he wanted them. He wanted to be very alert as to what could harm his family, and so he did not see these thoughts as being outside of him, but very much part of him, and thoughts he, on some level, wanted to have to keep his family safe because that belief was so fused. So as I was wondering, why didn't Daniel follow up? I was kind of mulling the case over in my mind, probably ruminating about it, and I thought of the case all the way back from my training, back from medical school, from my 4th year, that I wasn't part of treatment, but I was shadowing a 4th-year resident who was treating a patient where a similar issue came up. So let me tell you about this case. This is the case of Sylvia. Sylvia had come seeking treatment for intense grief, anxiety, and just feeling overwhelmed. And the source of all this distress was this. She felt that her husband was abusing drugs, and this was very distressing to her. And of course, as the resident who was seeing her at the time, he very much empathized with this. This seemed like a very tragic situation. She was in her 50s and her husband was abusing drugs. That's tough. But the more he met with her, the more he realized that she wasn't so much that she was distressed by him using drugs, which was a huge source of distress for her, but she was also frustrated that nobody believed her. Everybody seemed to doubt that he was. She even brought photos as evidence to the clinic. Photos of her husband laying in the recliner, overdosed. But when we looked at it, it just seemed like an older man taking a nap. But to her, these proved intoxication. She had even bought Narcan and several times sprayed it up his nose to wake him up from his opiate overdose. And when he kind of just startled and got angry about it, she took that as evidence of him going through withdrawal. She bought these little powders that she found around the home, which to us just looked like chipped drywall. And she actually sent these off to labs around the country to test whether there were drugs or not in them. And so the resident, after seeing her for a while, brought this case to a case conference, so basically where a bunch of psychiatrists discussed complicated cases, and that's where I heard about this case. And I remember there was large discussion in the room. One, what the diagnosis was. Some people weren't convinced it was OCD. It could have been like a delusional disorder. Some worried it might be a neurocognitive disorder, so like a brain condition occurring early on, earlier than would be expected in the person, or could be OCD or something else. And one of the more senior psychiatrists pointed this out. Sure, we can debate what the underlying diagnosis is, but she's coming to us for help with anxiety, for this stress. And so we should be able to provide treatment for that specifically. And yes, we understand that these other things might be going on, but we should first develop a therapeutic relationship with her and allow a path towards greater insight as that relationship develops. Don't argue with her. Don't try to prove her wrong. Don't try to convince her of a diagnosis. Hear her out. Let her understand what's happening and guide her to that. I think that with Daniel, I was too eager to point out a diagnosis, too eager to provide a treatment rather than hearing him out, building some degree of confidence in me, in our working relationship, to create a path towards insight and actually helping him with what I saw was causing the underlying issues. And luckily, to my surprise, a few weeks later, Daniel returned. The sleep was still an ongoing issue, and his wife was kind of over the whole contamination concern. She was getting very frustrated and told him he had to come back. So I agreed. Let's work on the insomnia. And let's do it in a way that we can pare down some of the compulsions at night, some of the worry of what's keeping you up at night. Let's focus on that and see how we can let go of some of the worry to improve sleep. Over the course of weeks and months, as we continued to meet, he did start to develop some insight. He did some more reading about OCD. He took note a little bit more of how this was affecting him, how it was causing issues in his professional and marital life. And though initially he wasn't ready to admit that he had OCD, he was able to notice and say that the rituals weren't helping. The constant compulsive checking wasn't making him feel any safer. If anything, was temporarily scratching an itch that would then itch all the harder later on. And the more we're able not to scratch that itch, so engage in less compulsions, the less intense his desire, his need for certainty around potentially lead poisoning became. Some increased psychological flexibility began to arise. His insight started to improve. We started an SSRI, and eventually I convinced him to start seeing a therapist on a weekly basis that specialized in exposure response prevention therapy, which is the gold standard for OCD. And sure enough, a year later, he was drinking tap water that was filtered only once, without being tested. So in conclusion, that brings me to the main misconception around OCD, that it's a condition of only irrational fears. Because for the people experiencing it, sometimes it can seem like a very rational fear. And I'll give you an extreme example of it here with Daniel, but certainly this plays out in all spectrums of OCD conditions, where people do become confused and have a hard time recognizing that their obsession or compulsion is OCD related, that it might be a problem, that it might not be within the normal realm of behavior that is sustaining their life, letting them live in line with their values. Thank you so much for watching to the end. I hope you found this informative. And if you didn't, please consider liking and subscribing. It really goes a long way. And I hope to see you next week in another mental health video. Thanks.